Hi, everyone. Welcome to this MBF Plus Montana Book Festival space. I'm going to maybe try to stall here for a few more seconds, couple minutes, well, not a couple minutes, a little bit here, just to see if anyone else shows up here. But yes, welcome into this MBF Plus space, the Montana Book Festival's virtual event space here on Zoom webinar. I'm gonna just start doing my little housekeeping spiel just because it tends to get long and we want to get into this conversation right away. So my name, first and foremost, I suppose, is Lauren Korn. I am the director of the Montana Book Festival. I'm so excited to host Anne MacKinnon and Sarah Bates tonight. But first, and as usual, I want to kind of talk through a few things. First, if you're interested in purchasing copies of Anne's book, Public Waters, I urge you to do so through our festival partner, Fact and Fiction Books. They've agreed to donate 10% of all festival titles purchased with them back to the festival. So you can go to factandfictionbooks.com, find Public Waters, and I'll certainly throw that link up in the chat here momentarily, and make sure to enter MBF at checkout so that we get that 10%. I also want to give a special thanks and shout out to our fiscal sponsor, Arts Missoula. They've been sponsoring us since 2015, and we, 100% could not do what we do without their help every year. So thank you, Arts Missoula. I don't know if Tom's on the call tonight, but he usually watches some shows. So, and then to our audience members, those of you watching at home, if you're interested in sponsoring the Montana Book Festival, or if you want to sponsor a month of MBF Plus events, you can email me directly at montanabookfestival@gmail.com. Additionally, it is the first day of our annual and Missoula's annual Missoula Gives. It's just a bunch of nonprofits in Missoula asking Missoula and the Bitterroot here in Montana to give back to their community and make sure that the nonprofits in the community can thrive and survive. So please feel free and please donate to the Montana Book Festival's Missoula Gives page. I'll throw that link in the chat as well. And then when it comes to this conversation tonight, please feel free to submit your questions for Anne and Sarah via the Q&A at the bottom of your screens. There's a Q&A and a chat. So if you can, relegate your questions to the Q&A, and any comments or just conversation, like I said, I'll be throwing some links in the chat. I'll do that in the chat so that we can kind of keep those two things separate. But yes, please do feel free to chat amongst yourselves while Anne and Sarah are chatting too. And with that, I am going to introduce Anne and Sarah, and I'll ask them to turn on their videos and their mics while I read their bios. First, Anne MacKinnon has a passion for translating natural resource management issues for general audiences. Having followed the coal industry from Kentucky to Wyoming as a journalist, she has made her home in Wyoming for 40 years. Part of a team that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, she became editor-in-chief of the statewide Casper Star Tribune and later helped found and direct the online in-depth news site wyofile.com. Armed with a law degree and eventually a PhD in natural resource economics, she became increasingly interested in how societies in arid places manage a resource as vital and scarce as water. She has organized conferences on water issues, tracked the work of state and tribal boards governing water, served 8 years on the Wyoming Water Development Commission, and has been an adjunct professor at the University of Wyoming. She lives in Casper, Wyoming. Welcome, Anne.
Thanks.
And Sarah Bates is the Acting Regional Executive Director and Senior Director for Western Water with the National Wildlife Federation's Northern Rockies, Prairies, and Pacific Regional Office here in Missoula, Montana. Sarah brings diverse experience from positions with nonprofits, consulting, and university research centers, and has published books, articles, and research reports, taught classes in public lands, water, and environmental law. She previously served as president of the Clark Fork Coalition's governing board and currently serves on the board of the Montana Watershed Coordination Council. And Sarah, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited for your conversation.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. And hi, Anne.
Hello.
It's such a treat to be in conversation with you. And I want to thank the Montana Book Festival for bringing us together. It's been a little while. thanks for the introduction, Lauren. And again, thanks for everybody for showing up. It's a beautiful evening in Missoula. And I'm glad it's also being recorded because some people may have opted to go hiking. But I'm really happy to be sitting here with Anne. This is great. I've known Anne MacKinnon since, I guess, the early 2000s. And I've know her in many capacities. She's a talented journalist, a water scholar, a brilliant thinker, an interesting and fun person to know. And now I knew you, Anne, when you had a couple of titles after your name. You had a JD, and now you have a PhD. That's new since we worked together. But we met through the Ruckelshaus Institute at the University of Wyoming. And you were at that time an adjunct professor and a frequent participant in our meetings. And I was always impressed with what you brought to those conversations. You brought questions that sometimes went sideways with the political sensibilities of the people that were part of the conversation, and always thoughtful and well-informed and provocative. So I'm really pleased about this. And I'm happy that we have our reason for coming together is this wonderful new book, Public Waters.
Thank you.
I just got my hard copy this week, but I managed to read online, so that was good. But it's a wonderful book, and I'm excited about. I'm excited to talk with you about it, and I thought I maybe would just give a little heads up to the folks participating about how we figured that we might do this. So Anne and I'll have a couple of back and forth questions. I pulled a few things out of the book that I thought were especially interesting or potentially relevant to a Montana audience. I think we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end, but it's also completely fine if you have a burning question or want to clarify something you heard to pop it into the Q&A as Lauren described, and I will be watching for that and bring that into the conversation too. But shall we begin, Anne? Are you ready?
Sure. Yes, I think I should thank the festival again and thank you, Sarah. I feel like I've known you longer than that because I used to watch you give talks at water conferences, and I've read your stuff for much longer than since 2000. So, but then we did get to actually know each other, which was very nice. So yes, let's start talking about this.
It's a small place, the West, when you start dealing with water issues. You get to know everybody, yes, which is great. Yes. So, and I really did enjoy reading through the book, and I had a lot of, I learned a lot about history. You researched this really thoroughly. I'd say about a quarter of the book is really deeply annotated notes. And, a book like that is so impressive. And it tells such interesting stories, including some human stories and a lot of stories about place, and a lot of lessons that go well beyond Wyoming, for sure. But to start with, I pulled out this one quote that just grabbed me, and I highlighted it when I read it. And you said, water connects people who might prefer not to know about each other. And that's not really the same thing as saying that water unites us, is it? But it does relate to interdependence. And I wonder, in the broad sense, would you say interdependence is in some ways the big idea of your book? And how would you frame your big idea and what you were trying to get at here?
Yeah, I think that's right, that water is uniquely a resource that creates interdependence, and often among people who otherwise wouldn't and might not like to know each other. And one of the other things that I wanted to suggest, because water is so important to all of us just to be alive and to our societies and economies, that it's important to understand that the law and the rules, the governance of water is something that reflects what's going on in the society, not always immediately, sometimes slowly, but is therefore, it's not written in stone. People often think, oh, our water law is sacred and, it has never changed and will never and can never change. Whereas in fact, it necessarily has to change, and has in the example of Wyoming. So in the example of Wyoming, that it's changed over time, and it's also had some of the aspects of, if you think about sort of resilience thinking and theory with kind of the infinity loop, where a system grows and changes, faces challenges, sometimes gets kind of rigid and maybe collapses and then new again. Wyoming's water law has a great example of getting very rigid. No, we don't like in-stream flow. No, we do not want to deal with tribal rights. And then, so that was started about 50 years ago, and that it's changed again since then. So I think and the interdependence is something that you don't see with all kinds of other natural resources. So in a lot of ways, water going through these cycles is sort of represents, it reflects what's happening in the society, and those kind of changes go on for all of us in a number of things, and water really reflects that. I may have gotten a little off the topic of your question.
No, I don't think so. I think you tackled the big ideas, and how water connects, and how it kind of is a symbol of our relationship to the resources, and also how, I guess, in some ways, the laws and policies that we put into place to govern these shared resources, they reflect our social values, and social values change over time. Our needs change over time. The demands for water aren't the same now as they were, say, in 1855.
Right.
And so a law highlighting or emphasizing one use might be ignoring some other needs too.
And that's the reason for the title of the book, which comes from this statement by this young engineer in his 20s who came to Wyoming and wrote, because he felt like he was sort of dealing with a blank slate compared to Colorado or California in 1889, and wrote the water law. And what he talked about was that the public water, I try to keep this quote here, the public waters should remain public property. To grant private perpetual rights is to sacrifice the welfare of future generations. And the reason for that idea is that if you then allocate everything to what seems to be the big need in 1889, and there's no further public role or consideration of the public welfare, then it's very hard to adapt to the changes that you're talking about. And in fact, if that had happened, and if that you would have to almost have a revolution type of conflict. And this book is really not about conflict. People love to say, oh, whiskey's for drinking, but water's for fighting. And it's a wonderful phrase. But really, it's much more about people going, oh, yeah, ooh, yeah, I guess we let's go here with this, because this place is not what we thought when we got here, and it's much harder to put the water to use in the way we imagined. And our towns are growing, or these people want water in the streams for fish. What do we do about that? So there's all this sort of changing over time, and of course there's arguments in the midst of it, but it's much more about people figuring out how to adapt to each other, and sometimes hitting the wall, but then finally getting around that and moving on with it. And I think you see that quite a bit right now with climate change and the other kinds of challenges that are coming to all of our water systems.
Well, that's great. You titled the book Public Waters. And so I did want to ask about the notion of public ownership of a resource, because most people, when they think about water rights, I bet the average person who thinks about water rights, which isn't necessarily the average person, but the average Westerner who does know and think about water rights thinks about that as a really deeply held private property right. And I wonder if you could kind of help distinguish between the fact that this is a public resource, but we have this notion of private rights. How does that relate?
Yeah, the public resource part is because it is so important to all our welfare. And in 1900, the Wyoming Supreme Court said, the welfare of the entire people is deeply concerned in a wise regulation of the use of the waters of the public streams. And the idea at the time, and this young engineer that came to Wyoming was we need to help societies grow. This would be Western type, European-based settler type societies. We need to get this resource into private hands. But Mead was very conscious of, and he tried to put life into what shows up in a lot of the constitutions and the case law in Western states about how, well, the state owns the water, and the state is the representative of the public in that framework. And what he created was a structure that, so that if you think about any resource, and water is a good example, there are a bunch of different kinds of rights. There's the right to get access to it and jump in. There's the right to actually withdraw it. There's the right to manage it, figure out things like dams and when and how it's going to be withdrawn and by whom. There's the right of exclusion. We're going to keep these people from using it and we're going to let these people use it. And there's the right of alienation, it's called, to let this right go to somebody else. And in Wyoming, this is just an example of one rural society, but those latter rights, the exclusion and alienation, are totally controlled by the state, and management sort of has shifted back and forth in different eras and different locales between the users and into whose private hands this resource has been delivered, and the state, so that it really represents a sort of a community management with the state and the individuals, and all of them recognizing this importance of water allocation affecting the public welfare and this interdependency. So that, I was I came to, as Lauren mentioned, I came to Wyoming 40 years ago. I came from Chicago and Kentucky, and they were spending millions of dollars here fighting over the North Platte River with Nebraska. And I was like, we would call that a creek where I come from. So what is this? What is this fight about? And I was very struck with how much people are like, we have private rights to this. But the more you look at it, it's a natural tendency natural, at least in this country and among us European-based settlers, to want to hold a private right. But it's pretty clear that that's in all the different sort of circumstances over 130 years that I examined, there's also this public ownership. And so I think I can expand a little, if you like, about what sort of how economists think about a resource and different ways of governing it. And this is true of grazing, forests, any kind of thing that's what they call a common pool resource, where it's where it's hard to keep people from using it, but if they do, it diminishes the resource. So there are all kinds of ways of governance, and what's developed here, I think, is true in a lot of places. I would suspect in Montana, I think in most of the West, but it's in some places it's kind of the backdrop, because you have these huge federal projects which have these big dams, and there you have, people have contracts on the water that's stored, and that's a much different thing than having a right to the water flowing by. So I thought it was helpful to look at this sort of rural backdrop of how people think about water. And even though they talk about their private rights, there's inevitably, they can't avoid this sense of interdependency and that the public welfare is involved. And that is an important thing to tap into now when we have such major challenges.
We do, and challenges that impact everybody, and really the reliability of the resource going forward. What I recall is one of the first things you learn in water law is the difference between owning the water and owning a right to use water. And that's, I always found that a useful distinction, that the public owns the water. The public continues to own the water, and that's true not just in Wyoming, but in the other Western states as well, as you pointed out. It's usually protected in a state constitution, but sometimes recognized elsewhere in judicial decisions. But that right to use it's a strange kind of a right. It's not like you own a piece of land and own it down below and up above. It's a right to do something with a public resource. And I think what you do really well in this book is you talk about how that gives an opportunity to reflect all those changing values about what about when you pull out a whole lot of water, put it to a particular kind of use, but it has downstream impacts. Are our values for the impacts, is that going to change over time? And perhaps part of the nature of that right to use is going to change. There's the opportunity for that with our system. That's the flexibility of Western water law. That's
the surprising flexibility. I mean, because people do think of it as, this thing I've got, but
it came down in the tablet.
But they know.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Well, you mentioned a little bit that this was all developed in the time of white settlement, taking land away from the native inhabitants, setting up rights and claims of ownership that didn't recognize everybody, and certainly not all of the uses that the water and the land had been put to over time. That's led to a lot of difficulties with our water management going forward, because in fact, the Native American tribes that entered into treaties with the federal government to cede some of their land, and they bargained for those, didn't they? And they bargained for the ability to stay on the land that they kept, that included necessary water to survive on that place. That's been problematic, though, because a lot of those promises haven't been fulfilled. You tell a really compelling story in the book about the Wind River Reservation and the outcome of a big fight. Do you want to, can you kind of summarize how that both reflects what's happening in Wyoming and also perhaps what needs to change? I guess how the fight over water rights in Wind River came down.
Yeah.
Enough to draw our viewers into wanting to read the full story in your book, of course.
Well, you sort of had me tuned into the Salish Kootenai Compact, and which I admire a lot. And by contrast, the Wyoming dispute over Indian rights has been the poster child for the West about what not to do, because the state sued the tribes in 1977, and in 2012, that litigation was finally over. It did not. It still hasn't. The results haven't really recognized the things that the tribes, the values that they hold for water, and it has left a bitterness that is only dissipating, probably as some of the key players go away or die. And so what happened briefly, the same sort of thing, as you said, you have the settlers come in, and the treaty in our case was 1868, the most relevant treaties. And the big case for Indian water rights, of course, came out of Montana, and it was decided in 1908. that yes, the tribes do have a right to waters that they reserved, and they have a right to, in treaties, and they have a right to not have to put it to use and lose it if it's abandoned, but they have a right to put it to use as and when they need to, and for purposes that they have in mind. And that decision was actually applied in a couple of small cases in front of the federal district court in Wyoming. But at the same time, the superintendents of the reservation, the white superintendents, were saying, oh, you know, we got you state rights. They didn't mention that any of this other litigation that was going on not very far away regarding the same reservation. And, you know, to keep those, you have to use those water rights. And so you probably ought to sell more of your land so you can get horse teams and other equipment so that you can put that water to use. And so they helped fragment the land resource even more. Finally, when the tribes in the 70s, young members of the tribe in particular were asserting these rights based on the 1908 case from Montana, the state sued them. And it was a classic example of what I said before, where it's like, no, oh no, this is not part of what we want to see happen with our water. Other things that had happened in Wyoming water had allowed a lot of development, which actually made the conflict worse between the different white settlers, because there had been allowed to be kind of an expansion of one of the white settlement permits over time. The litigation ended up saying the tribes could not put some of their future water that they hadn't yet used, that they were awarded the majority rights to the majority of water in that river, but a lot of it was for the future. And when they wanted to put some of that future water into in-stream flow, the state court turned around and said, oh, well, if you want to do that, I mean, you got to follow state rules, right? And we've already had the state say in-stream flow. A friend of mine loves to quote a legislator at the time who said, you're going to do that for fish? You're going to do that for fish? And this is on the floor of the legislature. Oh, and so anyway, the in-stream flow right was stymied, and the tribes did not appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court because it could have created a terrible precedent for nationwide. So, but I think, you know, court cases and court decrees, yeah, but that's not the end of the story. There's still room for people to figure out ways to say, well, let's do it this way. And so that Salish Kootenai Compact at the Confederated Tribes is just a great example of people figuring out how to bargain with each other, figure out who really wants what, and how to make it so that people, I think Wyoming is very much in need of saying, yeah, this is a sovereign nation who has a different idea about water than we do. And we gotta give them room to express those things because water is so important to them as well as to us. And I think when that happens, I hope I get to see it, that will be good for the whole state, certainly for that whole region of the state.
Well, it was a really significant finalization in December 2020 when the Flathead Compact was finally ratified, recognized by Congress, and signed by President Trump. The final compact that had been negotiated over decades between the tribes, the state of Montana, through the tool of the Montana Compact Negotiation Commission. So Montana took a different route with various, and pursued one by one, negotiated settlements with all the tribes to resolve the water rights claims and to reach a settlement where everybody compromised and yet reached a solution. And then when it goes to Congress, there's the opportunity for federal funding to, in some cases, invest in pipes and other infrastructure to improve irrigation projects so that some of the water saved can go to satisfy these long unexercised and unenforced Indian water rights. So there are lots of ways in which that process has brought better solutions. It's been no less contentious, I'd say, and the fights have been hard. But I think the outcomes, when you approach them with the idea that we're going to negotiate, we're going to reach a mutually satisfying solution, and we're determined to do that, and we're invested in doing it that way, it probably has a better chance of reaching a better solution for all.
I hope we can learn from that.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't always hold Montana over every other state for everything, but we're really proud of that, and for really good reason. There was a lot of foresight in setting up that commission and approaching federal reserve water rights that way. So that was pretty great. Your story, though, the way you tell it, I learned new things from it. I remember that outcome was so unfortunate, the decision not to go to the Supreme Court, the kind of sense of really deep defeat had to be very tough. And especially when you have a sovereign nation doing resource management on their lands and managing their water, and they have a water code, and they're trying to manage for fish and wildlife and recreation and agriculture and human use, and they're being told they can't make their own rules. That must have been very hard and hard to persevere.
Yes, I think so. I mean, of course, I'm just an observer from the outside. But yeah, it's been pretty interesting to watch how much capacity. There are two tribes on this reservation, the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho, how much capacity they've built in the Tribal Water Engineer's office. And they run the gamut of managing irrigation ditches to figuring out new projects to rehab to thinking about changes in establishment of water rights. So there's sort of several different agencies that I see at the state level combined, and they have been able to get some federal money, but there's a lot left to be done.
That's for sure. One of the experiences that we shared, Anne, back in probably around 2007, 2006 maybe, was a gathering of people interested in water and climate change in Wyoming. And even to gather people together to talk about climate change was challenging. And I give the Ruckelshaus Institute at the University of Wyoming a lot of credit for pulling it together and getting really top people in to come talk about the issues. And I remember how effectively the state climatologists presented the reality of what was being observed and then projected ahead, and didn't talk about the causes and didn't talk about who's to blame, but just said, this is what we're seeing and this is what we're projecting, and these are the implications for water. And I will never forget that at my little round table, discussion table, one of the members of the Water Development Commission, who was not a person you'd think was a big climate change, I guess, climate change advocate for dealing with it. He turned to the table and he said, his eyes were wide, and he said, I don't think our water institutions are up for this. And it was kind of a shocking moment, actually. And I do think it's both an existential threat, the level of change, and especially the impacts on water in the West, where it's already a place of water shortage and insecure supplies in many cases. The droughts and shortages that we've seen historically are likely to be dwarfed by the variations that are coming with climate change. Is it, I guess, asking you, do you think it is in some ways an opportunity for this system to flex and change and do things differently? And are you starting to see that happen?
Yeah, I do think it's an opportunity for really the same kind of thing we were just talking about with the tribes. I mean, there needs to be a determination to deal with it and to include everyone in it, whether they have a water right or not. And the at the same time, when you were talking about that climatologist who was a very courageous and thoughtful guy moved on. I think he's doing climate work in Alaska, because really Wyoming at the time was totally not ready to hear it. I was on the Water Development Commission at the time, and the Water Development Commission was and is funded by mineral revenues in Wyoming, and it was kind of Wyoming's Bureau of Reclamation. And when we had a lot of coal production, it was a big engine for both new projects and new dams, but also for rehabilitation of irrigation projects. And we were doing what was called the state framework plan at the time, and climate change was not allowed to be mentioned in that plan at that time. But since then, even on sort of local watershed planning, I've seen a guy who, a different person than you mentioned, but somebody who was a former state senator and very involved in all these issues, and somebody would have described them as a water buffalo at some point, probably. He asked that in the watershed study that was near his town, that there be some discussion of climate change and what could happen. And that was with 2 years ago. So seeing that happen, I think there really is, that it is, oddly enough, an opportunity. I mean, it's so difficult because climate change doesn't mean, oh, the climate of New Mexico or Colorado is going to move here. I mean, it means, hey, who knows all the different things that are going to happen, that it's more uncertainty. But I've been involved in the Wyoming State Engineer's Office, like the water managers in the other upper basin states on the Colorado River have been involved in trying to think through, well, you know, maybe we're going to come to a moment on the Colorado where there could be a curtailment, meaning that there might have to be use of less water in the upper basin states to allow enough water to go down that is required under the compact. And the compact dates from 1922, so things have changed since then. And so and some other people at the university, we've just been sort of managing the outreach for the state engineer's office and trying to get them to speak in English so people can hear what they're talking about. And it's very interesting. I would say, you know, it's sort of both things. Not enough people have really come to those meetings, but the sort of significant people who are the water leaders in their areas have come. And they are trying to sort through it and figure out what climate change might mean for them. There's some significant glaciers in Wyoming, in the Wind River Range, that affect the flows in the Colorado, and also affect the timing of flows, just late season flows for irrigators down below the mountains. And you know, they're sorting through a lot of things about what would make sense for them, but it's an ongoing discussion. So I think there's real hope that that will, and people are, I think, again, not just thinking about who holds the water right. Those are the only people that get to be here. No, it's more, yeah, but you know, the flood irrigation we do supports all this riparian stuff and the wildlife that we all care about. What do we do about that? So it's a pretty interesting discussion. And, you know, whether we can all do it fast enough, just as we have not done enough fast enough to actually slow down climate change, whether we can do enough to adapt is, you know, a big open question. And what we need to do to adapt, I don't know, but we all got to consult each other to try to figure that out. But I think there is possibilities for that to happen, and it is an opportunity.
Great. And it really does depend on finding and making use of this flexibility. And
yeah,
we interestingly, that relates to a question that came up, and I'm so happy that we have John Thorson in our audience, who is somebody who could be a lead speaker here. He's
yes,
a neighbor of ours here. He's lives in Plains, Montana, retired water judge, administrative law judge, and big thinker on Western water, and a special expert on negotiated settlements with tribes. So, John, I'm happy that you're here. We could unmute you to ask, or I can also just read the question that you shared. So why don't I start with that? And if you're willing to come on, we can also engage with you directly. But John asks, he says, the flexibility you see in the system, is this the result of judges, creative attorneys, motivated nonprofit groups, entrepreneurs, law and custom meeting scientific and economic realities? What has been the primary force for change, Anne?
I think it's been sort of the law and customs and realities. I mean, for me, it's one of the things that Elwood Mead was really proud of is you don't have to have a lawyer to come before these people, and we don't have judges making these decisions. We have these guys, and as it happened, they've always been guys, practical men, one in charge of each of four large watersheds for the state, and then in their own area, they're then the superintendent of that area. They come to meet to hear disputes or to hear proposals to move a head gate or to abandon a water right or to establish a water right. But in their own areas, they also are, yeah, well, those guys over there, I don't need to regulate that. And they seem to have come to some sort of agreement on that creek. So unless they call me, I'm not coming. And so there've been a lot of sort of local adjustments to local conditions, and it's the border control. These guys in interaction with the water users, who have been the most. I mean, some of the biggest change. Excuse me. One of the biggest changes has been Wyoming used to have a no transfer rule, and I discuss in the book how that came about. But it was the kind of thing that Elwood Mead had in mind. And then 60 years later, a transfer statute was enacted, but it was not the legislature's initiative. The Border Control had figured out over their 60 years, using various exceptions that were in the original 1909 statute, how to make that work and how to consider all that interdependence and still allow some transfer. And they did that in very close interaction with the water users who wanted to transfer or who did not want to see a transfer, and they considered all that. So that's what I think is the most interesting, is that it's not so much, this Wyoming Supreme Court ended up being, to my mind, sort of a disaster, because they made abandonment a taboo, because they thought about water a lot more like land than the water superintendents and the users did, I think. And so then you lose the ability to have something that's gone out of date. You lose the ability for that to drop and a new use to come in, because that right is still there with that water right. And the court even allowed revival of a 1890s water right, so it's like a time bomb sitting around in the landscape. So I don't think the court has been too great, and the lawyers have tended to argue that it's just a private property right. So I think it's more the on the ground administrators and the users, and that's where I see that kind of hope I was talking about also.
That's great. And in a way, what's also happened in this world is a lot of new players have come to participate in water rights.
Yes.
I mean, John mentioned his question, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They weren't part of the picture in the 1880s when people were claiming water rights and when it was getting recognized. Do you have any thoughts about sort of the changing role of groups like Trout Unlimited, or in our part of the world, the Clark Fork Coalition, or in some states we have water trusts that are negotiating for water rights? That's right. That's changed the picture altogether.
Yes, Trout Unlimited has played a really interesting role here, because they are working directly with users, mostly to improve those head gates and restore the rivers in a way that you can still extract the water, but you're not endangering yourself by getting in the middle of a spring cold stream in May trying to move around railroad ties, which some people were doing. You have a nice, easy to manage head gate, and the fish are a lot happier. They don't all get diverted up into your flooded field. And so they had developed a lot of relationships with people over that. And then when on the Colorado, when in 2015-ish, the states on the Colorado agreed, well, let's try to see if we could possibly, people would accept being paid to use a little less water. We're not going to try to measure it elaborately or figure out if it can get to some place and be saved, but let's just see if anybody would do it. And I thought that the state engineer here would have been like, oh my God, if I go ask anybody that, they're going to be like, you stay away. But what he was able to do was, because Trout Unlimited had these relationships, and Trout Unlimited offered to go say, well, we'll just, it's not our program, but we'll go tell people that it's out there in case they're interested. And yeah, particularly the younger guys were, get paid not to have to go struggle out there with all my, my plastic sheets and stuff that I try to move the water with. And I know of people who it's made such a difference in their lives to get that payment. It's not going on right now. This was an experimental thing, but they could fix up a house, or it's made a huge difference. And that is a wonderful role that Trout Unlimited has played. Now, they've also tried to make it possible for there to be water trusts in Wyoming, for there to be privately held in-stream flow rights. And every time the legislature is like, oh, you gotta be kidding, But it's gotten so it doesn't just fail introduction, it's gotten so it gets into committee. Well, this is over 20 years of trying, but it's slowly making its way. They're playing that role as well. And so I think there's, and they've won trust, which is a huge, huge thing, as we all know, for all of us and for NGOs and for social change. So, yeah.
I see we have another question has come up. Let's see, most Western states and Western users abhor the public trust doctrine, especially the California version that indicates the state can revisit water allocation decisions based on public need. You seem to suggest that some of those reallocations may be taking place in more subtle ways. So are we seeing a workaround with the public trust doctrine? And should you start perhaps by saying what the public trust doctrine is?
That person probably did a better recitation than I. I mean, there was a classic case, maybe you, Sarah, who have taught these things, can do a better job describing a public trust doctrine. But the idea is that, and it comes from a railroad case in Chicago, and then in California, that there's an underlying trust that the state holds and can revisit major questions of allocation. And that happened with the lake that had been dried up in California. And so Wyoming certainly is a place that would, again, to the words public trust, but this Constitution says you can, that an appropriation will not be denied except if in the public interest. I don't have the language right in my head, but something like that. And so there definitely is, and the state engineers actually did that once. Somebody was going to put a dam in a canyon that was the only way to get to the Bighorn Basin, 1/4 of the state. And that particular dam, there is one, but it's not in the canyon. And that particular dam was denied because it would have shut off access. And in fact, a railroad was built and a highway through there later. So let's see. I do feel that, particularly again, on this idea that it's what's coming from the users. I mean, Wyoming did pass a very limited in-stream flow law, but it was because of fishermen on its own streams who really cared about it. It was not due to, the Sierra Club. Maybe there were some local Sierra Club members, and there was a local organization, the Outdoor Council, which was started by the guy that also started High Country News. They were involved in it, trying to get in-stream flow. But what's happening now is you see towns saying, oh, it'd be great to have that creek that goes through town, to have it be kind of alive during the summer, because water pollution issues, water quality issues, and B, because people, tourism. And then you see individual ranchers who are interested in restoring their streams for their own reasons, and sometimes because they're going to host fishermen, but often just because they care about it. And so that seeps through. You don't see it statutorily yet, and you don't quite see it in Board of Control decisions, but I think you do see it in neighborhood adjustments. And I think there's going to be room for, and you clearly see it, as I said, in things like the discussions on big issues on like the Colorado River and aridification and climate change. Well, if we dry up that field and get paid for it, it's going to be terrible for this riparian area that we all care about, as well as the return flows that feed somebody else's irrigation. But they're talking about the riparian areas too, and how do we assess that? And we don't have enough information on it. So people are starting to press for, let's see if we have a better understanding of how this works ecologically, so we understand what we're doing to ourselves if we make changes to accommodate other demands downstream and demands that are increasing because of climate change, or at least their impact is increasing, I should say.
Great. I don't see any other questions here. We can wait a second, but I have another question for you. I guess it's sort of in the phrasing of a wrap-up question, but Anne, I wonder, with the years that you've been watching, reporting on, involved in water in Wyoming and well beyond Wyoming, the West, when you wrote this, did the research for this and wrote the book, did your mind change did you have a great big aha of any sort? Or did you find a new reason to think differently about water and how we're viewing and working with it as a result of your work on this?
Yeah, I got so interested in the I read the stuff that Elwood Mead wrote and the statutes, and I remember thinking, wow, it seems to work kind of like it reads in the statutes, which surprised me at one point. But trying to figure out exactly what kind of system is this, that it's and slowly coming to this realization that I think it is this funny community management. And you'd have people say, you know what that is? It's regulatory capture. These guys, all they do is pay attention to their users. Well, for one thing, they're not regulate. They use the word regulate, but they're not regulators in the sense of, an environmental regulation. And it's much more this sort of, not symbiotic, but this relationship that's kind of, that they work on the thing with each other. And I found that really fascinating. And I think you see it, and the fact that people are doing things that, sharing water in reverse order of priorities or something like that, as long as they all agree. And that sort of gives you a sense that there can be flexibility. And then also the changes that, I was very struck by this rigid approach in the 80s, which is when I first got there, and the anger over and the money spent to defend a rigid position on things like in-stream flow and tribal rights. And And of course, some of that is still there, but it is very, I have been like, oh, I think this is starting to change. And part of it is the state has had to take on a bigger role that people have had to acknowledge on the big rivers from the North Platte to the Colorado. And so that understanding of a public role and the role of the state representing the public, it's come more to the fore. And I think people sometimes resent that, but also it helps them sort of recognize and what they always kind of knew underneath, that it is a public resource. They are public waters.
Your focus is largely on the state management of water, the state regulation of water rights or recognition of water rights and protecting them. You mentioned a couple times about the role of the federal government, and it's been a big force in consolidating water rights into dam construction, and water management has a role in enforcing federal Indian reserved rights. But what else, how would you characterize the federal role, and especially in terms of this new direction that you've been describing, kind of a re-recognition of the public resource character of water? Do you think the federal government is playing a larger role in that sense, or influencing the state? And I hope I've rephrased the question that came in more or less appropriately. I elaborated on it a little.
I think the federal government has played a quite interesting and appropriate role in the sense of sort of making an issue come forward and convening people to have to address it. The North Platte is a great example of that, because the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act meant that the feds were going to reconsider the operation of the dams on the North Platte, which is not a well-known river, but is really one of the big workhorse rivers in the West. And it was only because of that idea that they were going to rethink how they ran those dams and that storage, to consider the impact on migratory bird habitat downstream in Nebraska, which has, of course, been there for millennia. That is what made people start, the three states, Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming, start to talk to each other and came up with a governance system that's a little bit like a compact. And it's a basin-wide governance organization that meets regularly. And there was some litigation meanwhile going on between Nebraska and Wyoming, which also got solved separately, but has its own governance thing, and they interact and so on. And similarly on the Colorado, the feds have been, we have to come up with, I'm losing the 2006 guidelines. We have to come up with new operational guidelines. And now 2026 is the deadline they're all working towards for new guidelines on how these are going to be run, in the face of, this has been a more than 20-year, people used to call it a drought, but maybe that's not the right word for it, on the river. And so how do we think about that? And at the same time, the compact looks from 1922 might look pretty like set, but people have working together since the late 90s. I mean, there's been a change there too, have begun to figure out, the states, how to work within that to accommodate even things like pulse flows in the Grand Canyon and getting water down to the Delta in Mexico. So I think the feds have played an important convening role. And I was interested to see that even under the last administration, the compact we were just discussing of the Salish Kootenai was approved, and the feds gave money to it.
It's sort of the role of the feds you might describe as recognizing and facilitating that theme of interdependence on a much larger scale.
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent way to say it.
Well, I think we are at the end of our hour. Lauren, I don't know if you're coming back on, but I think, it's clear, and why you're the one who wrote this amazing book, why we're gathered here talking about it. You're
thank you.
Such an expert. You're so conversant with the details, with the deep, deep authorities that lie behind what people speak about in kind of shorthand ways. And thank you. You're very good at translating some really complex topics out for people who aren't dealing with this every day. So thank you for coming and sharing that.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you again and to talk about this subject that we both love and that others find interesting, I hope.
Yeah, thank you both. Well said, Sarah. I learned so much, and I am obviously not well versed in water management or anything like that. So thank you both, and congratulations on the book. Sarah, thank you so much for being here. I threw the link to purchase the book in the chat, so please buy the book. Again, 10% of proceeds from Fact and Fiction come back to the festival so we can continue programming not only throughout the summer, but into the 2021 Book Festival in September, which kicks off in September. And please feel free to go to montanabookfestival.com. You can donate there, you can buy merchandise, you can watch more of these really wonderful MBF Plus events. So again, and Sarah, thanks for being with us tonight. And thank you to our audience members as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful night all.